Okay, so in this session, we're going to talk a little bit about flipping your classroom, which has been around for quite a while. It actually started back in elementary and secondary schools and moved up to colleges, and it got a lot more attention during the pandemic. And you've seen Bloom's taxonomy before, and one of the things we'd like to do is get students as high up on that scale as we'd like to, but do we always get students as high as we'd like? Or for example, if we assign work to students, is it likely, well, I'm tired. Okay, let me try that. But again, okay. So when, if we give students readings, let's say, and it's a traditional type of class, we give students some readings to do, then you have a lecture, maybe with some degree of interactivity, but students are expected to learn the basics outside of class. Do they always do that? I know my experience when I first came here was to tell students to read through a chapter, read through some materials, and then because I had done those types of things, I kind of expected students would, and I was a bit disappointed to see that they didn't. And one of the things that happened is, I know when I discovered that students hadn't done the reading, I might say, well, we really need you to do this before. But what happened is I started going over more of the basic things that I had hoped they would do outside of class, because we couldn't move up to higher levels of analysis unless the students understood the basic concepts. And so what I gradually started doing in my first few years of teaching, well, first many years of teaching, was lecturing more and more at the lower levels, giving them definitions and some basic applications and so forth in class. But they weren't doing as much work outside of class, in part because they saw that even though I asked them to read, I ended up going over it again, and students would realize, since this is going to be gone over in class, there's no sense in really doing that reading. And it could easily get into this downward spiral where you end up with students getting to not being able to get to higher levels in this taxonomy. So the principles of a flipped class is to turn this around a little bit. And the basic issue is, if we're going to lecture or go over some really basic concepts in class, we ask students to move up to the level of application or analysis, often on homework assignments we give them, or assignments to do outside of class, or when they get to a test, where we're asking them to take those concepts that we've been disseminating in class in a traditional lecture class, and students would have a lot of trouble with that they wouldn't be able to do that very much because they haven't really had much practice with it. And the principle of a flipped classroom is to take the easy things, the lower levels of Bloom's taxonomy, the basic understanding of concepts and so forth, and shift that outside of the classroom. And then use classroom time to focus more on higher levels of understanding. So the basic principle is that students would do some readings, they might have some videos to watch and other materials so that they could get some basic knowledge and come into class being able to deal with the higher level applications. And class time is spent on those things that students tend to find most challenging. Because we were asking, in a traditional lecture class in particular, we were often asking students to do the readings, which they tended not to do, and we focused more of our class time just going over really low-level concepts, and then we'd ask students to try to take those and transfer that knowledge into other applications without giving them very much practice doing it. So with a flipped classroom, we use class time on active learning materials where they're more actively engaged with trying to apply the concepts, maybe do some synthesis and so forth. But they'd be doing that at a time when where they're physically to support them, which is really helpful. And there's a lot of active learning exercises, and you're familiar with them, and we've seen lots of them. Team-based learning is one type of approach where you have students work in persistent teams from the beginning to the end of the class, and that's a really well-defined approach to working in groups or having persistent groups. There's also project-based or problem-based learning, where with a project, they have a long-term project that they work on from the beginning to the end of class, or at least for a substantial portion of the semester. Or problem-based learning, where you give them problems to solve and ask them to work through the problems in small groups. They're all closely related, but they're all active activities where you're leveraging some peer instruction and some peer involvement so that students form a community where they're assisting each other in learning. And there's lots of other resources, and we talked about some of those in other workshops. Peer instruction, though, is a really important part of this, because we know that when students explain things to each other, it reinforces learning, both for the people who have a better understanding, because the act of explaining something to someone else makes it much more likely that you'll remember it long term. Most faculty will know that they really learn the discipline when they first had to start teaching it to undergraduates, because while you have a good understanding when you go through grad school and so forth, in order to really know the material really deeply, it helps to be asked questions by people who don't understand it as well, or being forced essentially to explain things in a way that makes sense to other people really tends to reinforce your learning. And that's an experience that students doing peer instruction often find too. There have been a lot of research studies where people were looking at the effect of using undergraduate tutors or graduate tutors or undergraduate or graduate teaching assistants to support instruction in classes. And one of the things that has often been found is that the undergraduate students who worked as in-class teaching assistants ended up getting the largest gain in their understanding of any group in the class, more so than the graduate students, partly because the grad students started at a higher level, and more so than the students they worked with. So that act of explaining things to other students is really helpful, and that can work for any students in the class. And one of the things many of us often will tell our students is, if you really want to know if you understand something, try explaining it to someone else. Because if you can explain it to someone else, you've got a much deeper understanding than if you're just trying to memorize things to prepare for a test, for example. And again, peer instruction is really helpful in pretty much any study. And just-in-time teaching is also something that it tends to be a common part of a flipped classroom approach, because if you have students engage in active learning in the class, they're going to be working on problems and trying to apply the basic concepts that you're trying to have them learn. And you're there to assist them. And if you find that students are having trouble with some concepts, you can give some short lectures on it. But basically, when you engage in a flipped classroom, you're getting feedback from students through most of the class period on what they understand and what they don't. So if they're doing the work outside of class, if they're doing the basic readings or watching videos and so forth outside of class, you're able to spend your class time much more efficiently, so that if everyone comes into class knowing something or having a pretty solid understanding, you don't need to waste class time on that. If people come in struggling with concepts, you can spend more time on those concepts and help them get to that higher level you'd like them to. One of the challenges, though, with any type of a flipped classroom is that lectures are far less effective than active learning in promoting both retaining knowledge, long-term knowledge recall, and also the ability to transfer concepts from one context to another. But in pretty much every study, students believe that lectures are more effective. And part of the reason is, when they're listening to a lecture, especially if it's a well-constructed lecture, it makes a lot of sense. It all fits together. It all seems very logical, and they could just sort of let it pass by without doing a lot of processing with it. And they leave often feeling they really deeply understand something. But in a typical lecture class, they have problems when they're given a test on it, or when they're given some applications outside of class. When you're using active learning in the classroom, gaps in their understanding or incomplete understanding or some misunderstandings of concepts become really obvious very quickly. And that's not as pleasant. That if you try doing something and you discover you can't, it doesn't seem as productive. It doesn't seem like the classroom activities are working as well. But every study that I've seen that's been done on this find that while students believe that active learning is less effective, they learn much more than that. There was a big study done at Harvard about 4 or 5 years ago now, where they surveyed this essentially, where they compared students who were in classes that used extensive active learning and others that relied primarily on lecture. Students thought they learned more in the lecture class, but they learned significantly less. And the students in the class that used active learning scored significantly higher on the assessments that were used in the class, but they didn't believe they learned as much. So that's one of the barriers you have to get past. And students, for the most part, especially freshman students, haven't had much experience with a flipped classroom. And as a result, it's often a bit of a challenge convincing them that this is really working, because it doesn't feel as good. That when you're giving them problems and they struggle with it, it doesn't feel as good as listening to a lecture that makes sense to them. But again, the reason why it doesn't feel as good is because they have to wrestle with the material. They have to struggle with it. They have to do more cognitive processing. And it's that processing of the material, making connections, trying to use those concepts where long-term recall tends to be built. And it's really important, if you try flipping a class, to provide a really good explanation to students of why you're doing it. You can use a growth mindset, explanation. One thing I often tell them is it's sort of like the experience of learning any sport or learning to ride a bicycle, that when they first try something, they're not going to be able to do it right away. And you don't learn to play a sport or to ride a bicycle by reading a book about it or necessarily watching a video on it. You really learn it by trying it, making mistakes, learning from those mistakes, and becoming more proficient at it. And that's the type of learning that occurs in most of our classes, and reminding them that you can fail forward, that you can make mistakes and learning from them. And that's a really critical part of the learning process. And encouraging the development of a growth mindset can be really helpful, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. It sounds like it's something that I actually have been doing, but just didn't know there was a name for it.
Yeah. And I think during the pandemic, especially, a lot of people moved to many of these techniques and again, much of what people do have evolved because you're trying to get things that work better. And many people have moved in the same direction without necessarily having a term for it. That's come up in several other workshops with other people saying, oh, I've been doing that, but I didn't know there was a name for it, or I didn't know there was any research on it. And the research on this is pretty compelling. The couple of examples that really struck with me when I was first looking at this, one was probably about a decade or so ago, maybe even longer, maybe 12 or 13 years ago. San Jose State had an engineering course called Circuits and Electronics, which was taught in a typical lecture class where there was a group of TAs that assisted with weekly meetings and with grading and so forth. And the passing rate in the class was 51%, which was a major barrier in their engineering program. So they decided to try to flip the class. The instructor decided to try to flip the class. And what he did is he used a MOOC that was developed at Stanford, I believe, as an edX MOOC, which covered the basic concept, and that was done outside of class. But instead of lecturing in the class, the whole class was spent having students work on problems in class. So they got the basic levels of Bloom's technology, those lower levels outside of the class, and then they applied the concepts and worked through problems and developed their understanding in class. And what happened after they did that was the passing rate using equivalent exams and assessment jumped up to 91%, which was pretty dramatic. And they did that for a few years, but there was a bit of a rebellion on the part of San Jose State's faculty, who were really concerned about the use of MOOCs and this type of instruction. And they wanted things to stay personalized and to rely more on the individual faculty. And they shut down that experiment, actually, but it was remarkably effective. Eric Mazur, who was pretty much a founder of the use of clickers in the classroom, or certainly one of the most effective advocates for the use of clickers in the classroom, notes that about 23 years ago, I believe now, he was teaching a class, and he had started to read some of the literature from other faculty in physics who noted that while students were able to do really well on the test, where they were able to take numbers and plug them into formulas and get the results they wanted, when they were given some basic applications that involved intuitive applications of the concepts, real world applications, they weren't able to do it. And that some of their mental models of how physical rules applied actually seemed to be closer to the things they watched in on cartoons when they were children, than the way they actually behave. One of the examples he gave was one of the questions asked, if you swing a rock on a string around you and you release it, what will the path look like? And what many students, I think a majority of students said, is it's going to spiral as it goes through the air going forward. And in fact, that's not what the laws of physics would tell you. And similarly, what would happen if a car struck a train? What would be the impact on both objects? And they weren't able to do that. They relied on their intuition rather than on the concepts they learned. But Eric Mazzara thought, well, that clearly won't happen for my students. So he gave them a test, one of the force concept inventory, I believe it was called. And what he found is that his students ended up doing just as badly as students elsewhere. And he was kind of shocked by that. So he decided he was going to change his instruction. And in particular, one of the things that really worked with him was he was using clickers. He had just started experimenting with clickers, and he'd ask students to do some reading, and then he'd give them clicker questions where they got to be tested on it, and he'd get the results and so forth. And he was noticing they were getting stuck on some things, and he was getting really frustrated where he gave them a clicker question and most of them got it wrong. And then he explained it another way, most people got it wrong. And then he tried again, and people were just not getting the concept. And he at one point, he reached this point where he said, okay, I give up. Why don't you try explaining it to each other? And then he tried it again, and the scores jumped way up. That peer instruction that was involved really resulted in some very large learning gains. And that's basically the methodology that most people have been using with clickers and flipping the classroom in this way, or at least as one way of flipping the classroom. And he got some really dramatic learning gains, and he did some tests there. And also Carl Wyman did some tests, some research studies that involved the use of clickers. And what they found in Eric Mazzara's case is that from a pre-test to a post-test on some of these force concept inventories or some of the concept tests that were done, the students who were in the sections of the class that use clickers and active learning in a flipped class environment ended up getting a 3 times as large increase in the difference between their pre-test and the post-test scores. So roughly speaking, they were learning 3 times as much when they were engaged in active learning. That's actually about the highest results I've seen. But Eric Mazzara did the same thing in a larger study in chemistry, and he found learning gains that were twice as large when you compared pre and post-test for those sections of the class that relied on an active learning approach with clickers and so forth. And he, in his papers on this, you can see the whole distribution, and the distribution of scores on these standard tests were essentially had very little overlap, that pretty much the entire class did dramatically better when active learning techniques and a flipped classroom approach was used than in a lecture class. Very briefly, I've been doing this for several years, for about a decade or so in my Echo 101 class, and I've started doing it in my econometrics class here. In my Echo 101 class, I have students do some reading outside of class. I have them watch some short videos I put together with embedded questions. So they're getting to do some retrieval practice and check their understanding before they come to class. And I ask them to do this before class. And while I don't strictly enforce that they do all of them before class, they have to complete them by the end of each module. And most students will attempt them before they come to class. And then we work on problems in the class. So I do very little lecturing in the class. Mostly it's just in time teaching, where I'll explain things if a large proportion of, if much of the class is still not quite understanding something, I'll give a short impromptu explanation of it. Or perhaps I'll scaffold it a bit more, that if they're getting stuck on some concept, I'll put up another question that's a little bit at a lower level that'll help them build to the point where they can get back to it. And there's some cases where that often happens, where no matter what the readings are, students are going to get stuck on, and I can often predict that pretty well. And even if I put in some materials designed to work on it, it doesn't seem to work as well until they're in the classroom and they actually get to work with other students. So I've been doing that for a while. And when I first started doing it, I did some pre and post tests where in my department, every third year, we administered a test called the Test of Understanding in College Economics. And that measures how well our students do at the end of the class compared to a sample of college students throughout the US. And before I started using this approach, the students on average were at about a 50th percentile at the end of the class, which means they were doing about as well as other introductory classes everywhere. But once I introduced this approach, students were averaging about a 72nd to a 75th percentile for the median student. So the whole distribution shifted way up. It's dropped back a little bit now, and partly that's because of the prevalence of Chegg and other things where students are able to look up many of the answers. So they're not actually doing as much learning outside of class as I would hope, but they're still doing much better than they did before I introduced this. With Echo 312, with econometrics, I spend a good deal, I give students, again, the same methodology where I ask them to read a chapter of the book each week, because it's designed so there's roughly a chapter each week. I wrote the book there actually, which makes it easier to make sure it works that way. And then they also watch some short videos, and generally it's 2 or 3 videos a week, sometimes 4, but they're about 5 to 7 minutes each, with some questions embedded in. So they get to check their knowledge, and they can go back and redo those as many times as they need. So they could get perfect scores on all of them if they'd like. And then when they come into class, I give them some problems to work on, first individually, like Eric Mazur did. And then if everyone gets, or most students get it, we just move on to the next topic. But if students are struggling with it, half of the class will get it and half doesn't, then I have them work in small groups. And I've been using persistent groups for the last couple of years. And then I have them submit answers again using polling software. And then generally it converges where pretty much everyone gets it after they have a chance to explain it to each other. And in general, students seem to do pretty well with that. Things have changed so much in the last couple of years since I introduced it with the pandemic and so forth. But my informal perception is that they seem to be learning a lot more, and it seems to be, I'm not seeing as much of a variation in scores from the students who do the best to the students who do worse, because again, that act of explaining things to each other really helps narrow some of those gaps. Because I have some students who are math majors who come in with a really strong background, and I have other students who have often avoided math as much as they could. But again, when they get to work with each other, it helps eliminate some of the math anxiety and the other challenges that serve as a barrier, or at least tends to mitigate that a bit. Just some very basic stuff here. If you want to provide students, if you want to flip a class, you need to have materials outside of class for students. And one thing you could do is create your own videos and learning materials. And that was my approach, which I wouldn't generally recommend to people because there's lots of other ways of doing it. It takes a lot of time, but you can use existing materials, and there's so much out there now. If you do create your own, you could do simple lectures, the types of lectures you would have done in class, except breaking them up into small components. We've got tools here you can use. Panopto is free. Screencast-O-Matic, which a lot of people use for this thing, isn't free. Well, the basic version is free, but if you really want to use the editing features, it's between $1.50 and $4 a month. And I actually picked up a subscription just to demonstrate it because it offers quite a bit more capability than Panopto does in terms of editing. I tend, for my own work, I use Camtasia. I bought it way back, probably 15 years, 20 years ago now, when it first came out, and you can update it for like $50 a year, but it's a bit more expensive. But if you have access to that, it's a much more powerful program. We also have access to Adobe Premiere, which is even more powerful. And you can get that on campus from CTS because we do have an a collection of Adobe licenses. I don't use it as much, mostly because it is so much more powerful. It's also a lot more complicated, and it has a little bit more of a learning curve. And I hate to discourage people from using it because it is so very, very powerful. But I've also gotten so used to Camtasia that I just tend to use it myself. Adobe Spark has a lot of power though, and that's free, and it's very easy to use. And that will work, I believe, on laptops and also on iPads and iPhones, and I believe Android phones, Android tablets as well, and phones. There's also, for people who are using Chromebooks, there's Screencastify, which is basically like Screencast-O-Matic, and it works with Chromebooks. So if you're working on a Chromebook, it's a nice tool. Or if you want to have students create videos, they can use Panopto, but Screencastify is another approach that is often used. For people with iPhones and MacBooks and iPads, iMovie is a really simple and easy to use video recording that will do screen recordings if you'd like. Or even now, both Macintosh and Android and iOS and Android devices have screen recording capabilities built in. So if you want to demonstrate using an app, or if you want to demonstrate something or create a short video of something, you can do it by doing a presentation on slides or demonstrate some software right on your device and just do a quick screen recording. With a Mac, it's Shift Command 5 to start it, and then with Windows, it's Windows Alt R. And again, in iOS, you can go to your pull down that menu to get to your list of tools, and one of the options you can have there is a screen recording, which will directly record anything that's happening on your iPhone or your iPad. And I forgot how to do it on Android devices, but you can easily find that searching. So there's lots of good tools. And, you know, since we went remote, a lot of people discovered that since they already have a Zoom license, Zoom is a pretty quick and easy way to record things. So if you're going to do a lecture in class using Zoom, you could just as easily turn record on and stop recording as we're doing now, except, you know, you can do it all by yourself sitting in your room, which back when we first went remote, many of us felt like we were doing anyway, if we were trying to do any sort of lectures over to students who were in their rooms, often with really crappy connections and often, you know, not in the best circumstances. But in any case, it's a nice tool that will generate quick and easy videos and will also give you the captions directly. And there's lots of mobile apps you could use. Very quickly, some good practices. If you are going to create your own videos, keep them short and focused. You know, when students have long videos, like a lot of faculty will try to give like a 40-minute or an hour-long or even longer lecture. That is not the best environment to students to maintain attention. That while students may be able to watch like a nice movie or an exciting and interesting movie for that long, they're probably not going to be as engaged in listening to lectures. You know, 5 to 10 minutes is probably a good length. You can go a little bit longer if you need to, but keeping them short is helpful. Another thing, if you're going to create videos, is you probably want to do it efficiently and not do it every semester. So you want to do it in a way where you can use the same videos over and over again. Or even if you're teaching multiple classes where you have some of the same concepts, or if you're using some software applications that might be used in multiple classes, make videos, show students how to do it, but don't mention necessarily the date when you're recording things. Don't say, well, we have the Thanksgiving weekend coming up next week. If you might want to consider using that in a spring semester or in a summer course or some other time, or in some other sequence in the future. So keep any videos you create as evergreen as possible so they can be reused in other circumstances. And there are some nice tools out there to embed quizzes in the videos, because even if your videos are short, it's really easy for students or for any of us while we're watching a video to zone out and do other things. It's really easy to get distracted if you're watching a video, and it could be by any number of things. It could be by some of the video recommendations coming up on the side if they're on YouTube. So a really good strategy is to throw some questions in it. You can do that for free using Panopto or Edpuzzle. PlayPosit is what I use. It's a little bit, well, it used to be fairly inexpensive, well, moderately inexpensive. I think it was about $140 a year. It was just purchased by another company called WeVideo, and the price jumped up to $250 a year going forward, which is more than we really should pay for a basic learning tool. But I'm going to stay with it for at least a while, because I've developed probably about 140 videos using it that I use in a couple of classes. And given the work I put into it, it would be just simply simpler to continue using that. Although all the videos that I use are actually hosted on YouTube, so it wouldn't be much of a task for me to port them to some other platform. It's just basically redoing the questions and embedding the questions in it at the appropriate time. But that's something I've been trying to avoid, at least while I'm in the process of converting over to Brightspace for my spring classes. It's easier to continue using the existing ones than starting over. But what I'd suggest is using existing videos and resources. There's a tremendous number of videos on YouTube. Crash course when possible. If there's a set of crash course videos that relate to your class, they're incredibly well designed and produced. And I've got many of those I use in my classes as supplemental resources that are tied to some of the specific learning objectives. They're optional, but they're great resources, and students find them really useful. In math type courses or quantitative STEM type courses, Khan Academy is a really good resource. TED Ed is another one where you can create videos with some questions, and you can also use those created by other people. It doesn't link to the gradebook in the same way as some of the other tools do, but it's a really nice resource. Another thing, and I've mentioned this in some prior workshops, is using adaptive or personalized learning systems can do a lot of the work for you in providing students with the basic materials. They're basically textbook replacements that will design a custom learning path based on what your students know and what they don't know. So yeah, okay, you're using crash course videos. I use them as well. And every time I see a new one in economics, I'll look at it and say, this is great. And I wish I was able to create videos that were a fraction of as good as these are. And so, yeah, it's a wonderful resource, and they keep adding more and more of them all the time. The feedback from students has been wonderful. And Merlot, it's been out there for decades now. It's been there at least 25, 30 years, maybe longer. It's a learning object repository where people will create materials and share them publicly. And they're all free to download under various licenses. Normally, sometimes you require attribution, sometimes they can just be freely used. And many of them are peer reviewed, and they're really useful. Also, a lot of MOOCs, I know MOOCs have fallen into a bit of disfavor in the last few years, but a lot of MOOCs, especially those created in SUNY, were created with a restriction. Well, let me go back a step. In SUNY, any MOOC that was funded by the SUNY system with one of the IITG grants, one of the stipulation that was received for the recipients is that they had to release any of the materials they created for it as a Creative Commons resource, which could be freely reused by others. And that's true of many MOOCs created by many educational institutions. And many of the videos, for example, are hosted on YouTube, and you can just simply link to or embed those videos in your own courses if they were released under an appropriate license, and much of it was. And also, a number of institutions, including Harvard, MIT, and many others, have open courseware sites where faculty will post all of their course materials. They'll post their videos, they'll post recordings of their lectures, they'll post their exams, they'll pose homework assignments, practice problems, and so forth. And most of those are released under a license that allow them to be freely copied. Now, our students may not quite be ready for some of the exams at MIT, for example, or many of our students wouldn't be, but they could still, some of the resources, some of the recordings, some of the videos can still be really useful resources. Some of them are really high quality, others maybe less so, but it's a nice place to look to see if there's anything that might be useful and relevant in our disciplines. And I included a link here to a previous workshop on active learning and synchronous classes. I think you attended that actually, but I did put a link here in this. And then if you'd like to download the slides, you could take a picture of this for anyone who's watching us in the future. And I'll just put the link in chat. But if you just freeze this here, aim your camera at that icon, it will take you directly to the slides from that earlier presentation. Maggie and I had done that earlier this week, but I'll grab the URL. Well, this is the long URL. And this is actually an example, by the way, of the use of a copy link in Google Drive. And I messed up. Let me try that again. So I'm going to grab the link here, copy it, and paste it in the chat. And it's a really nice tool. Basically, when you create a Google document, and I know actually this was talked about in a workshop that Dave Perdue did last week, all you have to do is, usually it will say edit or view or something similar for the last word. If you just delete that last part and replace that with the word copy, it will allow you to download, to share a link, which is a downloadable link so that people can make their own copy of it. It's really good if you're going to use templates for student work or assignments, or if you're going to have them submit something in a particular form. You could just give them a template that lists all the parts of the assignment, and they get their own unique copy of it that they can then fill in and submit back to you as an assignment or something similar. And I think that's pretty much it. It's a very quick overview, but any thoughts?
I thank you for the information. I have an echo and that's kind of bothering me. So I'm trying not to talk, but
You're hearing an echo?
yeah.
Huh. Okay, we had that issue in a workshop yesterday too.
Yeah, I don't know why, but this has been very helpful because there's some things about it that I didn't know, in the practice of doing that's helpful. I guess did I write in my notes here? I don't know. I guess I don't really have any questions.
Okay, one problem I've had is that my course evaluations were much higher before I started doing this, but students have been learning a lot more since I started doing this. And no matter how much I've explained it to students, I always get, now I teach classes of up to 400 students, but I always get a number of students who say, I wish he would just teach me this stuff instead of making me do all the learning, to do all the work. And ultimately, what I try to explain to students is we can't do the learning for them, that we can create an environment that encourages learning. We can assist them in the learning, but ultimately you have to do your own learning. And that's not an experience that students are always used to when they arrive here.
And I think it's kind of it's a wise move to make to go to active learning because students are kind of more acclimated to zoning out, even if they don't know they are, from using cell phones and all kinds of devices and the way our brains kind of set ourselves into that they need to be active and moving to make sure that their brain is connected to the thing they're supposed to be learning.
Because students, we all to some extent believe we're good at multitasking, despite all the research and evidence on that is really easy to zone out. And I think the experience of the pandemic really made that dramatically worse, because when we first went remote, so many students were just sitting there, you know, without really being engaged. Even when there were times when I'd call on students, I'd try to get them to say something or do something. And it was hard that a lot of students seemed to be in Zoom, but there was that little blank screen. And when you'd call on them, or say, if you can't use your camera, and I never required them to use the camera, type something in chat. And a lot of students weren't really there. They may have been sitting at their computer, but they might have been doing something else at the same time. And I think that became a habit for many people. And to be honest, when I'm in a Zoom meeting, if there's a lot of people and someone's just there lecturing or giving a long talk on something, I will often be doing something else. I'll be checking my email, responding to it. And, I'm not terribly surprised that students might have gotten in that habit, but it doesn't translate very well when they come back to the classroom. And it didn't work very well with remote instruction.
Yeah. Agreed.
So,
one thing that I'm going to mention is that I just realized today that the polling workshop involves iClicker, and because of the type of classes I teach that are like usually capped at like 22 or 25 students, I won't be going to that.
Okay, well, what I wanted to say is that actually, the camera is off, and it says I'm connected to audio.
I still see you.
Where did that come from? Okay, well, now it's just one. I have no idea where that other connection was from, and maybe that's why there was. Did the echo go away?
Nope.
Okay, well, I was hoping that might have been it. It's probably these nearby microphones, which we added yesterday, that's picking up some sound from the speaker. But I've used it with classes as small as 16. And just as a thought, and the reason is, if you ask students a question, even if you rotate who you're asking and so forth, you're still generally hearing from one student at a time. And with using polling software, you get to hear from all of the students at once. And I had thought it was mostly a tool for larger classes myself, but then I saw a workshop given by someone for iClicker about 8 or 9, well, 10 years ago, maybe now. And what they noted was that, when you hear from one student, that might be the only student who doesn't understand something. It might be the only student who does understand it. And when you use the polling software, you get to hear from all the students at once. And it's really a good read to get a feel for everyone's attitude or everyone's understanding or everyone's perception. So it has a lot of benefit in terms of being able to reach all the students at any time. And so I wouldn't roll it out for small classes. And one nice thing is that since for the last 3 semesters and going on into the spring, SUNY Oswego is paying for the cost of the clickers. So there's no charge to the students. All they need to do is have a web connected device. It could be a smartphone, it could be a laptop, it could be a Chromebook, but as long as students have a device with them, they're able to participate in the quiz, whether they're in person or even if they're remote, because it's available over the network.
That might be something interesting to try with an English 102 class, because there's a real sense of disinterest among some students with being there more than in the past. And also, but they're not getting what they need to get. They're not listening, not paying attention, and not realizing what they're missing.
And it brings people back to attention. I've been telling this to people for years, and often until they try it, they don't believe it. One of the things that happens is I can see students starting to zone out in the large class, often pretty quickly. But then if you give them a problem to work on, or if you ask them for a response or reflection, because with the clickers, it doesn't have to be, originally they were, those mechanical ones or the wireless ones where you only had the letters A through E. But with this, you can do things where you could ask for short responses, you could ask for numeric responses, you could ask them to type a sentence or so into the clicker response, because they're doing it on a device, so they got a keyboard. You can ask them to click on a portion of an image. If you have a map, say, and you could ask them, well, where would this occur? And then you could, you can grade it and so forth. But when students know that they're they're getting immediate feedback, and all the students are getting that feedback, because if you ask a student a question and someone answers it wrong, everyone says, well, I wouldn't have answered it that way. This was something that Dan Ariely mentioned before he fell out of favor because of some potentially fake data or that somehow made it in the way of one of his publications. One thing he noted was that he would often ask people a question. Say he giving a talk to IBM or to other places, other people. He'd say, well, here's the research I was doing. This was a situation, and I asked people how they, and then how would you think people would respond in this circumstance? What would they do? And then he then explain what the results were, and people would then say, well, yeah, of course, that's how they behave, because they're able to explain it ex post. But what he started doing is he asked them to do a poll, to write down a response or use some sort of software to submit a response. And then what happens is all of a sudden they're confronted with the fact that what they thought would happen didn't happen in a way they can't explain away, because it's really easy to explain the result once you know what happened, but asking them to do that sort of prediction of what's going to happen in a certain experiment is something that is really good, because it forces people to commit to something and then getting that response. Now, again, how it's used varies quite a bit depending on classes, but if nothing else, you can always use it to ask students for their reactions to a reading, or for what they think about something, or what they think about a particular genre of literature, or if there's something that's read in class, you could ask them to respond to it, or you could ask them how the class is going, or what would make the class more effective, or what's not working as well for them. And some of those questions are even built in as exit polls that you can automatically set up. So I wouldn't rule it out, is what I'm saying. I've used it in classes. Again, when I've taught classes at Duke, we don't have the same software there, but I used other polling software. I used Socrative, which is a free polling tool, and it worked really well. And again, all the students are engaged actively in coming up with a response, and then you get to show the response. And one thing that people will do is they'll ask students to react to some type of a prompt. It could be a statement or whatever, and then have them do some readings, and then have them react again after they've learned more about the topic, and compare the results for what their beliefs were before and what their beliefs were later, and then ask them to reflect on the differences, why their views changed, and so forth. So there's lots of things you can do with them, that gets all the students involved all the time, with the results right there without you having to go through and read them and grade them separately, because they just pop up. If you're dealing with larger groups, you can even generate word clouds where you can see what words were most common. I've used that in a large class just to see how students are reacting. What are they having trouble with? What do they find most confusing? And looking at those word clouds will often highlight certain terms. I can generally predict what those terms are. It's usually something like understanding graphs, or doing the math, or working with, those types of things. But even then, they get to see that they're not alone, that other people are having the same struggles. And
I think you sold me. You sold me. Because I have an idea in my head now from it.
It's one thing that happens with clickers is I only know of one person who used them and stopped. Everyone else who started them has continued using them ever since. So I don't know. It's something I strongly advocate. And I've been doing workshops on these 3 or 4 times a year. So I've been pushing it as hard as I can, because students respond really well to it. Faculty like it. And there's a lot of research suggesting that it can enhance learning.
That matters.
So, okay. Well, maybe I'll see you later then. Well, actually, very soon.
Is it the next one, or?
It is the next one. So
okay. So do I have to leave and then come back?
Yeah, so that way it'll render the video. So I'll be back in just a couple minutes.
Okay, great.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Bye. I stopped the recording. Oh, no, I did. I stopped the recording now. Here we go.